The alchemist stands before the furnace, not as a charlatan seeking literal gold, but as a philosopher confronting the fundamental question of human transformation. This image, so often misunderstood, so frequently caricatured, represents one of Western esotericism's most profound metaphors, that consciousness itself must undergo a process of dissolution before it can be reconstituted at a higher order of being. The phoenix, that mythological bird consumed by flame only to rise renewed from its own ashes, serves not as mere poetic ornament, but as an archetypal blueprint encoded in the collective unconscious. When Heraclitus declared that all things are an exchange for fire, he was not speaking meteorologically but psychologically. The fire that transforms is the fire of consciousness, encountering its own limitations, its own contradictions, its own necessary destruction. Modern sensibility recoils from such language. We have been trained to seek comfort, to pursue pleasure, to avoid at all costs the descensus ad inferos, the descent into the underworld of the psyche. Yet every authentic spiritual tradition, from the Eleusinian mysteries to the dark night of the soul described by John of the Cross, insists upon a singular truth. Transformation without destruction is mere rearrangement. To become other than what you are, you must first cease being what you have been. This is not an invitation to self-annihilation in the pathological sense. The phoenix does not destroy itself from despair, but from developmental necessity. There exists within the architecture of consciousness a principle that Jung identified as the transcendent function, the psyche's inherent capacity to synthesize opposing elements into a new totality. But this synthesis cannot occur while old structures remain calcified, while outdated identities cling desperately to their thrones. The burning, therefore, is not optional. It is the prerequisite for all genuine metamorphosis. The alchemical tradition, emerging from Hellenistic Egypt and flowering throughout medieval Europe, constructed an elaborate symbolic vocabulary that modern readers mistake for primitive chemistry. This misreading represents a failure of hermeneutics. When Paracelsus spoke of separating the pure from the impure, when texts described the conjunction of sun and moon, when elaborate engravings depicted kings drowning in mercury baths, these were not laboratory instructions, but phenomenological maps of interior transformation. Carl Gustav Jung, recognizing this dimension, devoted decades to studying alchemical texts not as historical curiosities, but as living documents of psychological process. His insight was deceptively simple yet revolutionary. The alchemists were projecting their own psychic transformations onto material substances. The gold they sought was symbolic of the self, that archetype representing psychological wholeness and integration. The base metals represented the fragmented, unconscious, unindividuated condition of ordinary existence. The phoenix process, in this context, corresponds to what alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary phase of putrefaction that precedes regeneration. This stage cannot be bypassed through positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. Jung observed in his own life and in his patients that psychological development inevitably passed through periods of profound disorientation where previous meanings collapsed and existential darkness prevailed. He did not pathologize this darkness, but recognized it as developmental. The doctrine central to both alchemy and depth psychology is this: consciousness evolves through successive deaths and rebirths. Each stage of development requires the sacrifice of what came before. The child must die for the adolescent to emerge. The adolescent must burn for the adult to be born. And even adulthood contains within itself multiple deaths: the death of certain ambitions, the death of cherished illusions, the death of the persona we constructed for social acceptance. This process unfolds according to an internal teleology. The psyche possesses what Jung termed prospective functions. It moves toward wholeness not mechanically, but organically, like an acorn becoming an oak. Yet unlike the acorn, human consciousness can resist its own unfolding. We can refuse the fire. We can insist on remaining what we have always been, clinging to familiar suffering rather than risking transformation's uncertainty. The alchemical texts speak repeatedly of the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. This phrase has been misinterpreted as hubris, as an attempt to violate natural law. In truth, it describes the conscious participation in one's own evolution, the willingness to accelerate through intentional suffering what would otherwise require decades of unconscious repetition. The phoenix does not accidentally fall into flames. It builds its own pyre. This doctrine stands in stark opposition to contemporary therapeutic culture, which often seeks to eliminate suffering rather than transform through it. The alchemical Jungian perspective does not glorify suffering for its own sake. That would be pathological masochism. Rather, it recognizes that certain forms of suffering are developmental necessities, the heat required to melt what has become rigid, to burn away what is false, to reduce to ash what must be composted before new growth becomes possible. The central teaching, then, is one of conscious participation in an archetypal process. You are not merely a passive victim of psychological forces, but a potential collaborator with your own transformation. The fire will come, through crisis, through loss, through the inevitable confrontations life arranges. The question is whether you will merely be burned, or whether you will become the phoenix consciously entering the flames, knowing that on the other side of annihilation lies regeneration. The phoenix process unfolds through identifiable stages, each with its own phenomenology, its own challenges, its own alchemical correspondence. These stages are not strictly linear. Consciousness often spirals through them recursively, but they represent distinct phases of psychological death and rebirth, the recognition of insufficiency, calcination. Every authentic transformation begins with a moment of shattering recognition. This life, as currently configured, cannot continue. The alchemists called this initial stage calcination, the application of intense heat that reduces substance to powder. Psychologically, it manifests as the collapse of previous certainties, the failure of strategies that once seemed reliable, the sudden awareness that the persona you have been performing is fundamentally inauthentic. This recognition rarely arrives gently. More often it comes through what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites. Success reveals itself as hollow. Achievement brings not satisfaction, but existential vertigo. The very accomplishments you pursued become mirrors reflecting your own alienation. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may share phenomenological features. It is, rather, the psyche's revolt against its own confinement, the self-demanding recognition, the fire beginning to burn. Many attempt to extinguish this fire through distraction, through doubling down on what is failing, through seeking external validation to silence internal dissonance. These strategies constitute what alchemists called the false opus, work that simulates transformation while actually reinforcing stagnation. The phoenix at this stage must resist the temptation to flee from the flames it has itself ignited. The dissolution of identity, solutio. Once calcination has reduced the hardened ego structure to powder, the work of dissolution begins. Alchemically, this stage, called solutio, involves immersion in liquid, the dissolution of solid forms into fluid potential. Psychologically, it manifests as the liquefaction of rigid identities, the recognition that who you have been is not who you are. This stage brings peculiar terror. The ego, that executive function of consciousness that mediates between inner and outer worlds, experiences dissolution as existential threat. The boundaries that seemed so solid, between self and other, between acceptable and unacceptable, between who I am and who I might become, begin to blur. Dreams may become more vivid, more numinous, carrying messages from depths previously inaccessible. Synchronicities multiply. The rational mind, accustomed to control, finds itself increasingly unable to maintain its dominion. Jung observed that this dissolution often manifests through what he called invasions from the unconscious, the emergence of contents that cannot be assimilated by existing conscious structures. Symptoms may appear: anxiety, sleeplessness, obsessive thoughts, somatic complaints without medical explanation. These are not merely pathologies to be suppressed, but signals that the old container is breaking, that new contents are demanding accommodation. The temptation at this stage is to pathologize the process, to seek medication or therapy designed to restore the previous equilibrium. While such interventions have their place, particularly when suffering becomes unbearable, the alchemical Jungian perspective cautions against premature resolution. The dissolution must complete itself. The phoenix must fully burn before it can rise. To interrupt this process prematurely is to abort transformation, to remain half burned and half reborn, caught between states, neither here nor there. The descent into darkness, nigredo. The central and most difficult phase of the phoenix process is the nigredo, the blackening, the mortificatio, the death of the old self. All alchemical texts emphasize this stage as unavoidable. It is the midnight of the soul, the burial in earth, the rotting that precedes germination. Psychologically, it manifests as depression in the spiritual rather than merely clinical sense, a pressing down, a descent into the underworld of the psyche, where all light seems extinguished. This darkness is not the absence of meaning, but meaning's gestation in hiddenness. Like seeds germinating beneath winter soil, transformation occurs in darkness before it manifests in light. The error is to interpret this darkness as failure, as evidence that something has gone wrong. In truth, the nigredo confirms that the work is proceeding correctly. The old self is dying. The ego, that necessary but limited structure, is being relativized in relationship to the larger self. In this phase, previous supports fail. Relationships may end or transform unrecognizably. Career paths that once seemed meaningful reveal themselves as dead ends. Belief systems collapse. The very gods you worshipped, whether literal deities or secular values like success, recognition, or romantic love, show themselves as insufficient to bear the weight you placed upon them. This is what mystics call the dark night, what existentialists call authenticity's prerequisite anxiety, what depth psychology recognizes as the nigredo's necessary work. The phenomenology of this stage includes profound loneliness, even when surrounded by others. It includes the sense that no one can understand what you are experiencing because you yourself cannot adequately articulate it. Language fails. Previous vocabularies prove inadequate. You are between worlds, the old one dead, the new one not yet born. This is the phoenix in ashes, neither bird nor fire but the pregnant void between being and becoming. Crucially, the nigredo cannot be bypassed through spiritual practices designed to generate light. Meditation, prayer, yogic disciplines all have their place, but when deployed defensively against the darkness, they become obstacles rather than aids. The darkness must be entered, must be inhabited, must be allowed to do its work. Jung himself underwent such a period, which he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, during which he deliberately entered visions and dialogues with archetypal figures. He did not flee the darkness, but made it his dwelling. The emergence of the new form, albedo. After the nigredo comes the albedo, the whitening, the first emergence of light after darkness. Psychologically, this manifests as the beginning of integration, the first glimpses of a new order emerging from chaos. This is not yet full rebirth, that comes later, but the initial signs that the process has not been in vain, that something authentic is being born from the ashes. The albedo brings peculiar challenges. After the darkness, there is temptation to grasp desperately at the first light, to declare the work complete prematurely. The ego, exhausted by dissolution and darkness, wants to reconstitute itself quickly, to return to stability. But the alchemical work warns against this haste. The whitening is not the gold. The phoenix is not yet fully reborn. The new form is still fragile, still coalescing, still requiring protection and patience. In this phase, new insights arise with startling clarity. Patterns that were invisible now reveal themselves. The suffering endured in earlier stages suddenly makes sense, not as meaningless torment, but as necessary preparation. Relationships to aspects of self that were previously rejected begin to shift. The shadow, those parts of ourselves we denied or projected onto others, starts to be integrated. Consciousness expands to include what was previously excluded. Yet integration itself is work. The phoenix must learn to inhabit its new form, to navigate existence with renewed wings. Old habits reassert themselves. The gravitational pull of previous patterns remains strong. The work in this phase is to stabilize the new configuration, to allow it to settle and strengthen, before exposing it to the full intensity of worldly engagement. The marriage of opposites, conjunctio. The final alchemical stage is the conjunctio, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites, the achievement of the gold. Psychologically, this corresponds to what Jung called individuation, the realization of the self, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the reconciliation of all the warring elements of the psyche into a functioning whole. This is not the elimination of conflict, but its transformation into creative tension. The individuated person contains contradictions without being torn apart by them. They can be both strong and gentle, both rational and intuitive, both engaged with the world and rooted in solitude. The opposites that previously seemed irreconcilable, spirit and matter, masculine and feminine, light and dark, are recognized as complementary aspects of a larger unity. The phoenix, fully reborn, is not what it was before the burning. It carries the memory of the fire, the wisdom of the ashes, the knowledge that transformation requires destruction. This wisdom makes it fundamentally different from those who have never burned, who have never descended, who have avoided the fire. It possesses what the mystical traditions call gnosis, not intellectual knowledge but lived understanding, truth embodied rather than merely conceived. There comes a moment in the phoenix process when the entire undertaking seems like catastrophic error. The old self is dead, but the new self has not yet stabilized. You exist in the liminal space between identities, neither who you were nor who you will become. This is the crisis proper, not crisis as temporary difficulty, but as the decision point that determines whether transformation will complete or abort. In this moment, existential despair is not neurotic, but realistic. You have sacrificed certainties without guarantee of what will replace them. You have burned what was familiar, and the unfamiliar has not yet taken coherent form. The question arises with terrible force. What if there is nothing on the other side of this destruction? What if the phoenix is merely mythology, and you are simply burned? This doubt cannot be answered by reassurance from others, or by consulting texts, however wise. It is the existential confrontation that each individual must face alone. Jung called it the ordeal of the soul, the moment when consciousness must choose either to continue forward into uncertainty or to attempt a retreat into what has already been destroyed. The tragedy is that retreat is no longer possible. The burning has been too thorough, yet advance seems impossible because the way forward remains shrouded in darkness. The crisis manifests differently for each individual, but certain features recur. There is the sense of profound isolation, the recognition that no one can make this passage for you, that all advice and all wisdom transmitted from others is ultimately hearsay until verified by your own experience. There is the confrontation with meaninglessness, the possibility that all the symbolic systems, all the psychological frameworks, all the spiritual promises are elaborate fictions constructed to avoid admitting that existence is fundamentally absurd. This is where many abandon the process. They seek to reconstruct a simulacrum of their former identity, to return to unconsciousness, to forget what they have glimpsed of themselves and of existence. This constitutes what Kierkegaard called despair at not willing to be oneself, the refusal of one's own truth, the flight from freedom into the safety of inauthenticity. The phoenix, unwilling to complete its transformation, remains ash. Yet for those who persist, who remain in the fire without knowing whether they will emerge, who endure the darkness without certainty of dawn, something shifts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but subtly and fundamentally. The despair itself becomes generative. The willingness to face meaninglessness without flinching paradoxically generates meaning. The acceptance of uncertainty becomes a strange kind of ground. In the darkest moment of the soul's night, when all seems lost, the first light of authentic dawn begins to break. This is not faith in the religious sense, not belief in doctrines or reliance on external salvation. It is what existentialists call authentic being toward death, the recognition that finitude and uncertainty are not obstacles to meaning, but its very conditions. The phoenix rises not despite the fire, but because of it. Consciousness, purified by its own dissolution, reconstitutes itself on a new foundation, not the inherited certainties of culture and conditioning, but the hard-won truth of individual experience. The crisis, therefore, is not something to be avoided or minimized, but something to be consciously embraced. It is the crucible in which transformation either occurs or fails to occur. Those who pass through it emerge fundamentally altered, not improved in some simple linear sense, but deepened, made more real, more fully themselves. They carry the mark of the fire. They know what it means to burn and to be reborn. What emerges from the phoenix process is not a perfected self. Perfection is a neurotic fantasy, but an integrated self, a consciousness that has incorporated its own contradictions and discovered wholeness, not in spite of, but through its own multiplicity. The individual who completes this journey is fundamentally transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The most immediate transformation is in relationship to suffering. Having passed through the fire, one no longer relates to difficulty as something that should not be happening, as evidence of failure or divine punishment. Suffering is recognized as inherent to existence, as the heat that enables transformation, as the necessary friction between what is and what is becoming. This does not mean passive acceptance of all circumstances. The integrated self acts to change what can and should be changed, but it means no longer adding to suffering through resistance to suffering itself. There is also a transformation in authenticity. The person who has burned away false identities no longer performs selfhood for external audiences. The masks that once seemed necessary for social survival are recognized as optional, and their use becomes conscious and strategic rather than compulsive. This is what Jung meant by differentiation from the collective, the ability to think one's own thoughts, feel one's own feelings, live according to values tested by personal experience rather than merely inherited from culture. The relationship to the unconscious also changes radically. No longer experienced as threatening chaos, the unconscious is recognized as a source of wisdom, creativity, and renewal. Dreams are attended to, intuitions are trusted, the symbolic dimension of existence becomes visible in a way it was not before. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that rational materialism dismisses, are experienced as communications from the deeper layers of psyche and cosmos. Perhaps most significantly, the integrated self develops what might be called existential humility. Having discovered the limits of ego consciousness, having been dismantled and reconstructed, one no longer harbors illusions of total control or complete understanding. There is recognition that consciousness emerges from depths that remain largely mysterious, that the self one has become continues to be in process, that further deaths and rebirths await. The phoenix, once risen, knows it will burn again. This integration does not produce a state of permanent bliss or uninterrupted peace. The integrated self still experiences the full range of human emotions, still confronts challenges, still makes errors. What changes is the relationship to these experiences. There is more spaciousness, more capacity to hold contradictions without fragmentation, more ability to respond rather than react. The fire has created in consciousness what metallurgists call temper, strength gained through controlled heating and cooling. The work of integration is ongoing. The opus is never truly complete. Consciousness continues to evolve, to encounter new challenges, to discover previously unconscious material that demands integration. But there is now confidence, earned through experience rather than borrowed from belief, that whatever arises can be met, that further dissolutions and reconstructions, should they come, will not destroy, but deepen. The phoenix has learned to trust the fire. In the end, what the alchemists understood and what Jung recovered for modern consciousness is this: transformation is not granted by grace or achieved through technique, but realized through the willingness to burn. The gold you seek cannot be found or purchased or inherited. It must be forged in the fire of your own becoming, in the crucible where everything you thought you were is reduced to ash, so that everything you actually are can emerge. The secret was never in the formula, never in the ritual, never in the teaching. It was always in the courage to enter the flames, knowing you might not emerge, yet entering anyway.